Hi everyone, I'm asbestos attorney Justinian Lane, and today we're going to talk about the health risks of short-term exposures to asbestos. Now, I get emails every week from all over the world from people who are accidentally exposed to asbestos and are now worried about their health. For example, I recently got this email from a woman whose first name starts with D. She wrote, "I was recently staying in Tustin, California, where there was a fire that burned down an old naval hangar, and I was close enough to smell the fire and even see big pieces of ash on the ground. I now have a dry cough and a headache, and the reason I'm concerned is because I heard the hangar had asbestos in it." Now, Dee contacted me because she was potentially exposed to asbestos when she was near an old hangar in Tustin that burned down. The hangar was in fact known to have asbestos in it, and now she has headaches and a dry cough after being near the fire. Is she experiencing asbestos-related health problems? Before I answer that, let's give a very brief refresher on what asbestos is and how it injures people. Asbestos is the name that we give to a group of 6 different minerals that share some special properties that made them very useful. Asbestos is incombustible, meaning it will not burn if you expose it to fire. Asbestos also does not conduct heat very well. Those 2 traits made it ideal for insulation and fireproofing. Let's take a quick look at a couple of artifacts from my personal collection. Now, in this jar is a piece of chrysotile asbestos. Chrysotile was the most commonly used type of asbestos, in part because it's easiest to work with. So this looks like a rock, but if I were to crush it, instead of turning to dust, it would turn into fiber that looks like thread. Let me show you what that looks like. This is actually chrysotile that has been turned into thread. Thread like this can be woven into other products, like asbestos protective gloves. I'll go ahead and show you a pair of those. Now, these gloves were made of asbestos, and I'm keeping them sealed in a bag because I don't want to release any fibers into the air. But if I did have proper respiratory protection, I could use these gloves to perform a trick that dates back to the 1800s, and that is holding lit charcoal in my hands. You can see that in this book. Asbestos wasn't only used for protective clothing. It was used in thousands of industrial and consumer products, including floor tiles, drywall, roofing shingles, and too many other products to try to list. Asbestos was once as common as plastic is today, but we stopped using it because of all the diseases that asbestos can cause. The first disease that was discovered to be related to asbestos exposure is a breathing disease that's called asbestosis. Asbestosis destroys critical lung tissue, and that in turn makes it much more difficult to breathe. The industry knew asbestos exposure could cause asbestosis by the mid-1920s. In the 1940s, the asbestos industry sponsored a confidential health study that was intended to prove that asbestos exposure wasn't harmful. Instead, the industry found out in 1943 that asbestos exposure could cause lung cancer. The industry learned this in the 40s, but the rest of the world didn't find out until 1955, when Dr. Richard Dahl published a landmark study that proved asbestos exposure could in fact cause lung cancer. In the 1960s, studies were published that proved asbestos exposure could also cause mesothelioma, a rare but aggressive type of cancer that affects the mesothelium, the thin layer of tissue covering most of our internal organs. In addition to asbestosis, lung cancer, and mesothelioma, asbestos exposure is also proven to cause throat cancer, stomach cancer, colon cancer, and ovarian cancer. So does Dee have to worry about contracting any of those diseases due to her asbestos exposure? Probably not, and let me show you why she probably isn't at risk. Our law firm worked with a top medical animation company in order to produce this video to show exactly how asbestos exposure causes diseases.
When we breathe in foreign particles, we cough to expel them from the airway. But asbestos fibers are tiny, indestructible needles that can embed themselves in the lungs or the pleura, damaging the tissue and causing hardened scars. In response, the body sends macrophages to digest and expel the asbestos fibers. But the sharp asbestos fibers pierce the macrophages, killing or warping them. This causes the macrophages to send the wrong chemical messages that cause the growth of carcinomas. Asbestos fibers also release free radicals that further damage the lung tissue and cause diseases to form. Not all of this damage is immediately visible, but over 20 to 50 years, asbestos can cause breathing problems like asbestosis, as well as mesothelioma and lung cancer. Similar processes occur when a person swallows asbestos fibers, and those fibers can cause throat cancer, stomach cancer, and colorectal cancer.
As you could see in the video, the more asbestos fibers someone inhales, the more likely they are to develop an asbestos-related disease. The medical term for such a relationship is a dose-response relationship. Now, lots of things have a dose-response relationship. Take caffeine, for example. 1 cup of coffee might wake you up, but a second cup of coffee might make you feel jittery. The more coffee you drink, the more likely you are to have a response to the caffeine in it. And an eyedropper full of caffeine might not trigger a response at all because there wouldn't be enough caffeine in the eyedropper. The trouble with asbestos is there's no eyedropper. What I mean by that is there's no dose of asbestos that science can definitively state will not cause a response in a person who breathes it. That's why the medical textbooks all say that there's no safe level of exposure to asbestos. Any exposure at all could potentially cause a disease, but there are lots of people who get exposed to large amounts of asbestos and never get sick. Science can't yet predict who will and won't develop an asbestos-related disease, but it does give us 3 factors to consider, and those are intensity of exposure, duration of exposure, and latency since exposure. Let's talk about those individually. The first factor is the intensity of exposure to asbestos. Intensity in this case refers to the amount of asbestos that's in the air that someone is breathing. The clip you're about to see is from the early days of the asbestos industry, and you can literally see clouds of asbestos dust in the air. The people you're looking at worked to turn raw asbestos into asbestos yarn, and as you can see, that was a very dusty job. They eventually learned how to measure the amount of asbestos in the air, and today we express that measurement in fibers per cubic centimeter of air. The job you were looking at would have been in the neighborhood of 120 to 150 asbestos fibers per cubic centimeter of air, and that's an incredibly intense exposure. Now, at the other end of the spectrum of exposure is me, right now. I'm filming this in a major city, and every major city has what's called a background level of asbestos in the air. Because of construction, demolition, and other factors, there's always a very small amount of asbestos in the background for everyone to breathe. Well, how small? Most studies put the figure at between 0.00001 and 0.00003 fibers per cubic centimeter, so my exposure is definitely not considered to be intense. But intensity of exposure is just the first factor. The second factor is the duration of the exposure. Remember dose response? The longer duration of exposure, the higher the dose. Back in the early 20th century, when people had very intense exposures to asbestos, people would sometimes develop asbestosis in as little as 1 to 2 years of workplace exposure. But that was for workers who worked in environments as dusty as you saw in the old film clip. That environment is truly a worst-case scenario, and the medical textbooks today recognize that under a worst-case scenario, as little as 1 month of extremely intense exposure could be enough to produce asbestosis. The final factor to consider is latency. In this context, latency means the amount of time from someone first being exposed to asbestos and the onset of an asbestos-related disease. The reason the asbestos industry was able to cover up the health risks of asbestos for as long as it did is because asbestos has a very, very long latency. Most of the medical textbooks state that asbestos has a minimum latency of 10 years and a maximum latency period of over 50 years. In other words, once somebody is exposed to asbestos, it would take a minimum of 10 years before they could develop an asbestos-related illness. So let's put that all together now to figure out how much risk that Dee is in from her exposure to asbestos. She wrote that she watched the fire and was close enough to smell the smoke and see large chunks of ash on the ground. I'll give her the benefit of the doubt and say that puts her within a couple hundred feet of the fire. I'll also give her the benefit of the doubt and say that she spent a full 8-hour day watching the fire. Although the fire and the collapse of the building absolutely released asbestos fibers into the air, it's not likely that she breathed enough of them for her exposure to be considered intense. The duration of her exposure is 1 day. 1 day of mild to moderate exposure is not enough exposure to cause asbestosis. The absolute minimum exposure necessary to develop asbestosis would be 1 month of absolute worst-case exposure. But what about cancer? Is she at risk of that? Now, there's several types of cancers known to be caused by asbestos exposure. The cancer most strongly associated with asbestos exposure is mesothelioma. Unfortunately, there's no known level of exposure below which it could be guaranteed that a person will not develop mesothelioma. So Dee is at an elevated risk of developing mesothelioma, but it's a very, very slight elevation of risk. Let me give Dee and others like her a little peace of mind. One of the things my office does is offer free health tests to people who worked around asbestos. We've tested a number of people who worked making chlorine. What you're looking at now is called a diaphragm cell. One of the ways to make chlorine involves filling these cells with asbestos fibers. Now, we tested a number of people whose job was to pack those cells full of asbestos. At the plant I'm thinking of, there's a job title called asbestos fluffer. Asbestos fluffers literally take asbestos out of the bags, fluff it up, and then pack it into the cells. We've tested a number of asbestos fluffers who, believe it or not, had a clean bill of health even after working with asbestos every day for years. Of course, just because an asbestos fluffer is healthy today doesn't mean they won't develop an asbestos-related illness years later. After all, it can take 50 or more years to develop mesothelioma after being exposed to even a small amount of asbestos. Asbestos exposure can also cause someone to develop lung cancer. Was Dee's one-day, low-intensity exposure enough to cause lung cancer? Probably not, unless she has previously been exposed to asbestos elsewhere. Most medical authorities believe that while any exposure to asbestos can cause or contribute to the development of lung cancer, a person would need a minimum of 1 year of intense exposure to asbestos in order to develop lung cancer. So in all likelihood, Dee is not going to develop lung cancer from this exposure. What about the cough and headaches she reported? Well, coughing is definitely a symptom of asbestosis and can also be a symptom of lung cancer and mesothelioma. But Dee was exposed to asbestos a couple of weeks ago, and it takes at least a decade or more to develop lung cancer or mesothelioma after being exposed to asbestos. Any coughs or headaches she's having are a result of breathing whatever else was burning in that hangar, and I'd advise her to talk to her doctor about them as soon as possible. I hope this video helps anyone who has been exposed to asbestos and is afraid for their health. Asbestos is absolutely a deadly substance and you should never breathe it, but a brief, accidental exposure is not going to cause you to develop lung cancer or asbestosis. It could potentially cause you to develop mesothelioma, but it probably won't. And it definitely won't unless you were exposed to asbestos at least a decade ago. Thanks for watching this video. I'm asbestos attorney Justinian Lane, and if you have any questions about this video, please leave them in the comments below, and we'd appreciate a like or a subscribe.